Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Delegate Corner. I'm your host, Sinkas, and in this podcast, we'll spotlight delegates from the Optimism ecosystem. Our first guest is Michael Vander Meiden, also known as the Blockchain Guy. If you're active in Optimism's governance, chances are you're already familiar with Michael, as he's a very active contributor, and he's also hosts the biweekly community call. In our chat, we discuss about Michael's background and how he became involved with crypto and Optimism, how he became a delegate, and also his views on the current state of Optimism governance. Let's get to it. Well, hello, Michael. Thank you for being on the podcast. It's glad to have you on board. Would love to start off by just listening some things about you and like your background, how you came to get involved with Optimism, things like that. So whenever you want, just kick it off.
Sure. Well, I guess we can start back a little bit farther because I don't get a chance to tell the story of how I got into crypto too often. Um, I've actually been around since 2014. When I was in college, um, I took an interest in Bitcoin. So that was during one of the Bitcoin bull cycles way back when, and I decided to build a mining rig and use the dorm room's electricity actually to mine Bitcoin for free. Um, and so that was really my first kind of dive into what is blockchain, how does blockchain work, and even then I didn't really understand a whole lot, but it at least piqued my interest to the point where from then on I was watching the industry. Um, Fast forward to 2017 and the bull market then, and I was paying attention, but I was really turned off by a lot of the scammy type IPOs that were all over the place. And while some of the projects seemed really interesting, I kind of distanced myself from the space a little bit during that time, because I never really got into any of the projects that actually were legitimate. So fast forward a little bit, a few more years, right kind of towards the start of COVID and the pandemic is when I really started diving really deep into crypto, more so as we know it today. Um, and yeah, as far as optimism goes, it's an actually interesting story. I mean, I was aware of optimism and the different L2s, but as far as knowing the people or the governance or any of those things, I never really had a favorite, or I was never really deeply involved in any one of them. But I actually followed Kelvin on Twitter Kelvin Fitchner, one of the core people at Optimism, and he had some threads um, on explaining different exploits and how the hackers uh, exploited certain protocols. I think there was one of them was one of the bridge hack. He had a whole thread on it, so I was following him, and then he said, "Hey, if you contribute to Optimism code base, you'll get a free NFT." And at that point, I had quit my Web2 job, and I was kind of full time, just looking for the next thing to do. And I was actually actively looking for projects that maybe I could get involved with in Web3 because that was what was really exciting to me. So when I saw that, I was like, "Hey, I know how to code. Let's go check out their GitHub and see what I can do." So I picked a really easy issue on GitHub, and um, Kelvin and the people at Optimism were great at just walking through, because at that point I was a complete outsider. I didn't know anybody, but they kind of walked me through how to contribute to their code base. I contributed my first issue, and um, and yeah, I got my contributor NFT. Fast forward 1 or 2 months maybe, and I went to Dev Connect in Amsterdam. And so at this point, I already had a little bit of an affiliation towards Optimism, or Optimism at that point, because I had contributed, I was like, yeah, I like Optimism. They're cool. So when I went to Dev Connect, I actually got to meet Ben Jones, one of the founders, and a few other people there. And I just thought they were really cool, fun people. And so after that, um, after that is when I started listening to some interviews and I really found out what the vision behind retroactive public goods funding is. And so that's really what hooked me, you know, thinking that if I'm going to spend my time somewhere, making this vision possible is a good use of my time. Um,
Awesome.
yeah.
Awesome, really insightful. And you did mention committing to like you're making your first contribution on GitHub. You did mention going to DevConnect, and you did mention being in your dormitory rooms and kind of like having a mining rig. And the question it immediately brings to mind is, what did you study? Do you have a technical background, or what's like your academic background?
Yeah. So before Web3, or I guess kind of adjacent to Web3, was I was studying mechanical engineering, and then I ended up studying robotics. I got a master's degree in robotics. And the reason I chose robotics is because I wanted to switch to computer science, but I was stuck with my mechanical engineering background. So a master's in robotics kind of bridged the gap between those. And then when I was actually working, I was working for a startup, a Web2 startup doing machine learning work. So within robotics, there are a bunch of different fields. Um, the part that I was mostly focused on was machine learning and computer vision. So basically processing video data and photo data from cameras on a robot into actionable commands. So I was working on that for a while, but then I was working in that for maybe 3 years, 2.5 years. And the company I was working for was basically kind of, it was a retail store company. It was basically technology, using this kind of technology for retail stores. But I never really fell in love with, I loved the work and the actual problem solving. I thought machine learning was interesting. I still do. But I never fell in love with, if I was as successful as I could be at my job, my previous job, how would that affect the world? Right. And so over time, I realized that just having a fun problem isn't really good enough to motivate me. It matters what the outcome of the work is. And so that's one thing I love about Optimism is I don't know of any project in crypto or in Web2 that if it's successful to the maximum potential that it could be successful, that could change the world more for the better. And so that's really what sucked me in and made me stay here and actually want to put hours in and contribute. It's just the whole big vision.
Amazing. And speaking of contributing, I think most people that are watching or listening to the podcast and are already in Optimism already know you for hosting the community calls. But I was wondering if that's what initially drew you to crypto. Was it governance? Was it? I know some people got into crypto because of just blockchain and cryptocurrencies. Other got through NFTs. Others for DAOs. So what was the thing that initially brought you to the space? And what would you consider or say that is kind of like your area of expertise, if that makes sense?
Sure. It's definitely changed over the time that I've been involved with crypto. Initially, like a lot of people, the promise of Bitcoin of having this independent financial system that's really controlled by the people was what really spoke to me. Kind of some of those libertarian kinds of ideas, right? I mean, that was almost 10 years ago now. And so, you know, what's attracting me to Bitcoin, or what has attracted me to crypto, has changed a lot over the years. But then when I first really became involved um, with crypto again in this most recent cycle where I basically started working full time, was more so DeFi to start out. But DeFi in a way that could empower people and basically improve the world by reducing inefficiencies. Because right now, if you think about a company like Uber, they're taking a cut of every single ride. And a lot of times the drivers aren't happy with what they're making, and people who are paying for the taxis, it's too expensive. I mean, Uber is just kind of an example that everyone might understand. But one thing that I dove pretty deep into was disaster insurance. So I actually had briefly a startup trying to create an on-chain disaster insurance marketplace. And when I say disaster insurance, I mean natural disasters like hurricanes, wildfires, earthquakes, things like that. Without getting too deep into it, it's a market where a lot of people can't even buy the insurance because it's so expensive, but it has a ton of efficiencies because there are layers on layers on layers of middlemen. And so it's a problem that seemed like it would be great I still think it's a great problem to be solved with crypto. That startup didn't work out, but um, that really drew my interest for a while. And then as I've been getting more into optimism and governance and things like that, the main problem, so along with DeFi, the other main thing that interests me is human coordination. And so that's one of the beautiful things about optimism is with crypto, you can design these really interesting economic incentives to coordinate humans on a large scale. And you can have other incentives as well. Economic incentives are kind of the easiest to design and wrap your head around, right? But there's lots of the design space for this is absolutely enormous, and um, and so those so as of right now, those kinds of incentive systems interest me the most in crypto, and it's actually not new because some of the work I was doing in machine learning was collecting data from a crowd. It's called learning from the crowd. It's basically it's kind of like an easy example is CAPTCHA when you have to solve like the I am not a robot question, right? They're actually using that data as training data for machine learning algorithms, but designing how people what is the balance between allowing people um, to put in random answers versus making it really, really strict. And how do you combine all of these things into one big data set that actually is really good? All of these things kind of map over to crypto as well, because you have to design these incentive systems very, very carefully to get the outcome that you want. And so I think that's one thing that I think Optimism is doing its best at and has the biggest vision for. And yeah, that's kind of what interests me right now.
100% agree with the coordination problem being appealing. That's kind of like what somewhat like brought me to the space as well. Of course, yeah, combined with the culture of kind of like more libertarian culture that exists in cryptos in general. And I didn't know very interesting about the capture. I didn't know that. I was wondering why they keep getting harder, harder to solve.
Yeah, not every CAPTCHA does that, but a lot of the big ones like pick all the buses or something like that. Most of them are actually uh, feeding that data into a big data set. Yeah.
Cool to know. I thought I was starting to become a robot there. And awesome. So I think in part you did cover. Like I was gonna ask what brought you to Optimus specifically, but through the previous answers, I think you pretty much touched on that and covered. So I'm gonna go a bit deeper and ask you what urged you to become a delegate in Optimism and why you chose to do so.
Yeah, so becoming a delegate, um, it was pretty random to start. I just happened to be browsing the forums when they talked about, hey, anybody can become a delegate. All you have to do is post in this thread, fill out your delegate statement and things like that. And that reminds me, I actually haven't changed my delegate statement in a long time. I think I might have updated it once, but I definitely need to go back and take a look. But at that point, I still was kind of an outsider uh, within Optimism and within most of crypto as a whole. And yeah, like for example, when I showed up at DevConnect, I knew absolutely zero people. I had nobody that I wanted to meet. I had nobody who knew who I was. I was there by myself. But the great thing about those conferences is you really do get to meet a lot of people pretty quickly. But back to the delegate thing, yeah, it was pretty random. I just kind of thought I didn't even really know what it was, to be honest, because at that point the token had not even launched. And I just thought, hey, like I might as well put my name down. Maybe it's a way that I can get involved. I think Optimism is interesting as a project. And let's just do it. And so then after the airdrop and a little bit of delegation, I started actually kind of paying attention to some of the votes and actually trying to, be a good delegate, do the research on the proposals, look at the forum, and yeah, that's pretty much how it started.
Awesome. Yeah, I would think with the amount of participation we have in activity, I would think it would be a bit more targeted. But I also believe that a lot of people came to be involved in many different areas, not just in governance, but also with projects in general. I know myself for sure have in kind of like in a similar manner, kind of like sort of it happened. But awesome to know more about that. And what do you think is the hardest thing about being a delegate? Because it's easy, to put your name down, get a bunch of tokens, delegate to you, and vote. But I think it's more than that, and I would love to hear your opinion. Being an active delegate, what's kind of like one of the difficulties you've faced, either in terms of available tools or communication with your with the people that delegate tokens to you? What has been a challenge for you?
Sure. Well, I think one interesting thing that I actually think is really good about Optimism governance and OP collective governance is that we're rapidly iterating, right? Every season, if you look back to season number 1 or season number 2, the way we're doing things now is completely different. But for delegates, especially delegates that are not full time, like I am, it's very hard to keep track of everything. Very, very hard because not only do you have to keep up to date with the proposals and when I say proposals, I mean everything going on the forums. Whether in this season it was mission, but then there are also other votes that are required, research and feedback and everything. You also have to keep in your head the context of the current state of the governance system as a whole. I think this is going to get better over time for a few reasons, because I know a lot of people right now, a lot of different groups are working on resources to simplify and condense the basically educational material for delegates, to condense uh, everything that's going on in the season into something that's easy to digest. And I think as we iterate more and more, eventually those iterations will slow down as we start finding a groove into what is working for governance. And I think even though these iterations might have been painful as far as learning the new system, they've all been steps in the right direction. They've all been improving on things that were that needed some work beforehand. So I think it's a worthwhile pain, but it is pretty painful for delegates right now. I'm curious what you think as someone that's kind of coming into the system, and do you feel like you have a good idea of all the things that are happening in governance land right now within Optimism?
Good question. I think you're pretty much on point in terms of time needed to be on top of everything. It's basically a full-time job, not just in optimism or governance, but also like broader in crypto. I think if you're in the space, you pretty much heard time and time again that it's becoming a full-time job just to keep on top of everything's happening. And I had a similar thing when I started kind of like participating in governance and optimism and started kind of like getting my feet wet. It's like there's so much information to digest, so many things to know, how everything's working. And if you're reading like from the beginning, the different iteration, the changes, and you need to keep on top of everything. So I can imagine how difficult it must be as a delegate, not only to keep on top of the processes and frameworks and the governance systems, but also every like individual proposals, as we saw for season 4, for example. So many proposals to go around, and I imagine having to review all of them and create kind of like an opinion on all of them, and maybe provide feedback or interact, and then have to vote. I do assume and I imagine it can be very, very difficult to keep on top of everything unless you are allocating like a full-time gig to it, basically.
Right,
But also,
right.
like, if I chose to become a delegate myself, the number one thing that I believe would be difficult for me would be getting my voice heard and putting my name out there. And that's in general, like if I want to decide to be, more active on Twitter, for example, it's difficult to gain a following and an audience, but at the same time, governance work is more specific than that. So I think that's kind of like my biggest question would be, where do I begin to actually have people delegate tokens to me? I can put out a mission statement and create a delegate profile, but where do I go from there? I think that would be my kind of like my biggest challenge or difficulty.
Yeah, so I think this is actually a great question, and I didn't mention it during my response to your previous question, but I was thinking about it, that this is another challenge for delegates coming in, is getting that that initial delegation, right? Even for myself, I don't know if you know, I'm pretty active as far as being in the community calls, posting other different calls. My face is everywhere, but my actual delegation is not as large as um, it's been going up very, very slowly from the initial airdrops. So so it's a great question. I think there's been a lot of discussion. It's really an active area of discussion of how we can fix this problem. Um, as far as like some things that we've talked about as far as fixing the problem on a community level is having some of the bigger delegates spotlight some of the smaller delegates, because some of the top delegates have like a large percentage of the voting power, and they don't even want more voting power, right? They've even said, this is going to work better for everyone if we're more decentralized as far as our voting, and so one thing that they can do is spotlight smaller delegates to actually, um, you know, like have any new delegate tours that are coming in to go to them instead. We've also talked about changing the UI on Agora. They actually just changed the default, I think, instead of just showing like from the most delegation to the least, they've it's a weighted, it's weighted by size, but it's random now. So you're more likely to see a fresh set of faces when you tune in. But for individual delegates, I would say there's two different things. So first of all, try and get involved in Optimism on the forums. To try and have your voice heard, contribute your opinions. There's a ton of space for people to critique proposals and to do a little bit more research into different proposals or different projects if a project has a mission. There's also a ton of space to contribute in those ways for past projects. So projects that got grants last season, or 2 seasons ago, to actually go and make a post on the forum saying, look, this is where this grant went, this is what they did with it, using all public information. Those things would be extremely valuable to the community. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that less than a year ago, I was a complete outsider, completely, nobody knew who I was, right? Just by volunteering and contributing, when there was an opportunity. So Katie Garcia actually started the community calls, and she hosted the first couple, and then she wanted to pass it off to somebody. It was open for anybody to volunteer, and I just volunteered, and I volunteered for the next one after that, and the next one after that, and then eventually I just kind of became the de facto host of those calls. And there's all these opportunities everywhere within Optimism governance, and if you do contribute, people will start to recognize your name, and you will be able to build your reputation, even if no one knows who you are at the moment. So that's one big thing. The other big thing is if you have any kind of community outside of Optimism governance, but within crypto as a whole or other projects on Optimism, that's also a great place to start, is drawing on your community. So getting your community involved in Optimism governance. And if you don't have one, you can start building one. Start a podcast like you're doing now, and or a Twitter Spaces or a blog or YouTube channel, or a company. Any of these things are ways where you can kind of build a community around yourself, and then that would also help bring in people to be delegators to you.
Pretty on point advice, I think, for new delegates. But yeah, my number one advice as well, in general, if you want to get involved in governance, is contribute, contribute, contribute. That's the only thing that matters at the end of the road. And that's the only way you can get your voice to be heard and get your name out there, basically, if you want to do more things within that protocol in which you are contributing. But
if anybody is listening and they're hearing this, but they don't know where to contribute, send me a DM, because trust me, there are a lot of different ways, based on whatever skills you might have, a lot of different things that you could do to contribute right now.
yeah, that's another thing that I see in many DAOs is people join and they want to contribute, but they're not sure where to start. And it ties to what we mentioned before about information being too much and not a lot of time for individuals to go through everything. At least if it's not their full time thing. So I know
Right.
myself have faced a similar issue, and in fact, shout out to V from Optimism Foundation. She was actually the one to steer me in the right direction in terms of how to contribute to the community. So yeah, shout out to V.
Awesome. That's great to hear. And I'm pretty sure almost everybody that I know that is within autism delegation, or like within autism governance, that are some of, the core members that have been around for a long time. Every single one of them would be happy to bring you into the fold, point you in the right direction, and basically help you find a way to contribute. And so I think, because we have Discord, Twitter, the forums, we have all these different methods of communication, getting a hold of someone might be a little bit tricky, but once you do, I'm sure that that they would help you. So don't be afraid to ask for help. If you're actually willing to, you actually want to contribute for real, people will help you find a path to do that.
And speaking of optimism governance, I would like to take a step back and kind of like talk about the state of governance as you see it now. Things like where are we strong, where are we lacking, in your opinion, of course. What are some areas we could experiment further with, and yeah, in general, like what are some practical new features we could use, things like that. Like, how do you see the general state of optimism governance?
It's a great question. I think so. Starting from just the good side is, we really do have a large group of people that are contributing and interested in optimism governance, right? This podcast is an attestation to that. I think there are a lot of people out there that see the optimistic vision and think it's cool and want to contribute. And that's attracted a lot of really smart, competent people to be working within OP governance. So that's one of the big strengths that we have, is the people that are involved. Another big strength is the willingness to iterate, which we talked about a little bit before. But we've created this system of governance that's so so much more refined than when we first started, or at least we've iterated to the point where we're very far away from where we were when we started, for the better. And so I think these things are really good. As always, there's a whole lot of space to improve. And I think that's one of the exciting things about being in optimism governance right now, is that there are so many areas where we could get better. I think one interesting area is data-based decision making, data-driven decisions. So I know there are a couple folks at OP Labs, Michael Sibberling and Junshin or something. I'm sorry, I'm butchering the name. But they've put together some dashboards, and they've started kind of contributing a lot to looking at data of the grants programs and how they've been effective and things like that. But I think this is an area where community members can do a lot to kind of pull out that data, even if it's qualitative data. just looking at the effectiveness over the past seasons of different grants and different decisions that have been made. So I think that's one thing, just because so many decisions have to be made every single season, and people are busy with focusing on what's happening now. I think having a little bit more time and more people looking backwards and seeing how things have played out is something that there's a lot of area to improve. I think the delegation process, like what we were talking about before, this is an area where right now, I'm sure if you looked at the amount of times where people move their delegation, like the average wallet, I think this is a really interesting question actually. How often does the average wallet move their delegation? What I would expect to see is that people delegate once when they first get OP tokens or when they first get their airdrop, and they haven't changed it since then for the majority of wallets. I know that there are some people that are coming into OP that are choosing a delegate to start new, and there are some people that might change the delegation once in a while. But as of right now, I think that's a very static process, right? There isn't a whole lot of motivation to change who your delegate is if you're not actually involved in Optimism governance. If you're just a user on the network, there's not really motivation to do that. So that's something that, like we said, it's an open discussion, and but it's something that if we really want the delegation system to improve and governance to be very strong, it should be merit-based, right? If the delegate is doing a lot of really good work, they should be getting more delegators. And so matching those two things is a work in progress. Another thing that I think is something that I'd like to see more of going forward is having more contributors. So I know from being on the grants council and also from looking at the mission proposals for the season from the different alliances, the quality of grant requests that we've been getting has been improving. So in this cycle for the grants council, I think there were over 100 different applications just for this first cycle, and there are 3 cycles in the season. And of those, a lot of them were actually quite good. But especially for the missions being a new thing, I think getting more and more contributors and more builders actually proposing missions and trying to build those missions, so there's more competition for those mission budgets. I think that would be better for everybody if we kind of increase the number and the quality of those projects. I think it has been increasing, and I think that I'm not really complaining about the quality right now, but I think that making that better. So, okay, right now for one of the mission budgets, it's 1 million OP for one of the intents for this season, and I'm pretty sure of the missions that got approved to go to a vote, almost all of them still fall within that budget. So even if they all got approved by the token house, there would be enough budget to go around and then some. It would be great if we maxed out the budget with missions that were all super high quality. So if maybe there were just 10% of missions were actually successful, right? And we maxed out the budget, I think that would be great for Optimism if we had that many people building high quality projects. So, and I think that's just a matter of awareness, and it has been improving rapidly. I've seen this season, there are a lot more people interested in contributing than last season. And as the seasons go on and more builders realize that there's this opportunity for them, I think that will improve as well.
Yeah, pretty much. That's kind of like my understanding from this season. I wasn't involved in the previous season, but this season I did see a lot of very interesting proposals, lots of them within the budget, as you mentioned. So even if all of them passed, we would still have budget to go around. And yeah, I get your point. I think having more people contribute, more missions proposal will be even more ideal. I think it might have to do with the whole like bear market that hit the the general market, but also crypto, I think it drove a lot of people away, and maybe now they're kind of like coming back slowly. So hopefully things improve as the markets improve too. But ideally, you don't want that to be based on the markets. You want people to be contributing because they believe in the optimistic vision and they want to contribute anyway.
That's actually an interesting point about the bear market, where for most of the time that optimism governance has been active, we've been in that bear market, right? And regardless, optimism governance has grown a lot, and it's gotten better and better with more and more involved people. And I think that's really a testament to, um, how interesting of a project it is when it's growing like that in the throes of a bear market. And so I kind of like that it's a bear market because the people that you get might be a little bit more in it for the mission. But if if crypto sentiment changed as a whole and things really start going up, it would be interesting to see how governance could absorb that that change.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely will be interesting. And speaking of missions in general, I know that you yourself had proposed a mission and it successfully passed. So, firstly, congrats for that. But also,
Thank you.
would love to hear a little bit more about that. I know it's for a podcast covering retroactive public goods funding, which is a very big part of optimism, very important one. So, would you like to talk us to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. And I actually proposed two missions this cycle. For the other one was for a website called opdelegate.com. And so I'll just go into both of them. The for the retroactive public goods podcast, I think it goes right along with what I was just saying, that we have this big pool of retroactive public goods funding. They've announced that it's going to be 30 million OP in um, in Q3 of this year. And so that's a huge amount of funding. And I think getting the number, I think as of right now, the work to reward balance is so good for builders that if you're not building something for retroactive public goods funding, you better have a really good opportunity that you're working toward, because retroactive public goods funding is a really, really big opportunity. The I think in order for retroactive public goods funding to be successful, we need to get enough builders building things for the entire optimism ecosystem. And the whole point is that we're spending this money so that people can build more things on optimism. Well, it's not money, but we're distributing these tokens so that more people can build um, things on optimism, which makes the whole ecosystem better, which in turn through sequencer fees or whatever it ends up being, creates more tokens for retroactive public goods funding, and we create this positive feedback loop. But the key point, right? So right now we have the funding um, from the initial airdrop or whatever, but we need the other half of the equation to basically support it needs to be self-sustaining, right? And for that, we need builders. And so the idea behind the retroactive public goods funding podcast uh, is to basically spread awareness on how some tangible things that people can do to contribute, whether it's bigger teams or even just smaller individuals like myself. Um, there's a lot of space where people can get involved, and actually it can be lucrative because that's how this whole system is designed. If you do good work, you'll be rewarded for it. And so in the past, we've had a huge number of really high quality retroactive public goods funding recipients. And a lot of them have their own communities and their own audiences. So for example, there's DeFi Llama or L2Beat or different podcasts or um, women in Web3. I think I'm saying their name wrong, but there are lots of different individual communities that qualified for the last round of retroactive public goods funding. So the idea is to have conversations with these people, with these different communities, so that they can bring the community into the fold of people who are knowledgeable about retroactive public goods funding and what's possible with it. So the goal for that podcast, if I were to look back and to think it was successful, would be basically the number of people that are building for the collective, with the goal of getting retroactive public goods funding. So the second project that I have, it's called opdelegate.com, and it goes a little bit more into this data issue that we've been talking about before. The idea is that this is not something that's in competition with Agora or anything like that. The idea is that it's kind of a home base for delegates to look at their delegation and actually be able to understand where their delegation is coming from. And so as of right now, unless you're writing custom Dune queries, there isn't a whole lot of information about delegation. I don't even know if 90% of my delegation comes from one address. Of course, that data is on Fame and it's easy to access if you know how to write Dune queries. But the goal with this website is basically to create like a per address dashboard where any delegate can go and see how their delegation has changed over time, the breakdown of their delegation, and then eventually you might be able to put in things on the website, which would be open source, of course, maybe some educational material about being a delegate or things like that. And so ideally it would be a place where, let's just say somebody has their own community and they put out a tweet to their community asking them to delegate their tokens to that delegate. With this kind of information, they'll be able to see, was that tweet actually effective? Did they get any new delegates from that? How much OP were from those new delegates? And what did those delegates look like that they were able to bring into the fold? And I think by giving those tools and giving that information, putting that information into the hands of delegates, delegates will be able to make better decisions. So, okay, maybe they ran an in-person event where they got a lot of new delegators from that event. Then they'll know that if they run more in-person events, then they might be able to convince more people to delegate to them. And so that's kind of the idea behind that project, is putting that data in the hands of the people who are actually actively trying to improve their delegation. So I think that's one potential avenue to solve the problem of sticky delegation, where people aren't moving it around.
Amazing. Yeah, and I think it's very much needed tooling. I'm a big fan and proponent of what I like to call proactive transparency. Not that people like to recite that, oh, it's on chain, it's visible, it's transparent, but realistically, some things, like as you mentioned, if you don't know how to write Duna queries, you cannot get access to that data, even though it is visible. So having user-friendly dashboards where somebody could look into that, that's what I believe makes it truly accessible and visible and transparent. So yeah, pretty much really looking forward to that, especially as somebody who is very interested in seeing data points basically and analytics.
I couldn't agree more. I like that phrase, proactive transparency. It's good. Yeah.
Awesome. And starting to close it off here, in very short, in a nutshell, if you will, where do you see the OP DAO from in a year's time or 2 years' time? Where do you think we want to ideally be as a DAO?
It's a great question. When I'm thinking about how to answer that question, the thing that really comes into my head is retroactive public goods funding. So even though this is not necessarily within token house governance, right? It is still part of governance as a whole. And I think 2 years from now, you'll be able to judge whether or not Optimism is successful or not based on whether or not the retroactive public goods funding is self-sustaining. I think that it will be. I think that we'll get there. But so my positive, prediction is that 2 years from now we'll have enough builders building on retroactive public goods funding that the pie is growing bigger and bigger, and that there's just this runaway network effect with people building for the Optimism ecosystem. I hope that by then we'll have some crypto use cases that are really breaking into the real world. So with EIP 4844, reducing fees, and with account abstraction, making wallets and interacting with the blockchain more user-friendly, I think all of these things combined with Optimism and retroactive public goods funding really set the stage for Optimism and the OP stack to be the place where everybody is, both builders and users. We haven't even talked about the OP stack, but I think when talking about governance and where that will be, somehow it will be some kind of integration of all of these different OP stack chains that make up the super chain. So the OP stack is the technology. If people use that technology in a predefined way, they can still customize it, but in a way that where these different chains can communicate. Within 2 years, we might get to the point where we have this super chain infrastructure with this horizontal scaling that you'll have base from Coinbase. You already have Zora, right? The NFT chain. You'll have all of these different chains that are communicating with each other, and that will create this kind of mega governance infrastructure where you might have individual governance for each chain, but also the OP collective as a whole will have its governance. And so yeah, that's really where I see it. Just like this big super chain with tons of users and self-sustaining retroactive public goods funding. I think if we got to that point, we would really be in a place to change the world.
Pretty neat, and I couldn't agree more. I know I'm personally really looking forward to see what the future has in store for us in terms of where we go and where we want to be. Very amazing. And to kind of like keep into the tone of the podcast and for the goal of the podcast, which is to spotlight delegates, of course, but also to help some smaller delegates with their discoverability, as we mentioned earlier as well, which is a hurdle, especially for new delegates. Do you have any delegate off the top of your head that you feel hasn't received the love they deserve based on their contribution? Someone who could use a little bit more delegation.
It's a good question. There are a few names that come into my head. So I know, I'm not sure how much delegation he has at the moment, but I think that Gunna, he goes by Gunna, has done an absolutely amazing job as a delegate. Out of everyone I can think of, I know he's not one of the top biggest delegates. He's kind of medium sized, but he's just been so involved. I've worked with him on the grants council. He's been doing a great job internally with operations, and he's just always, he's a powerful player, bringing more people into Optimism, helping everybody, contributing feedback. So I think he's done a really good job. I think maybe a smaller delegate that I've seen getting more and more involved recently is Bricia. I know she started recently, and she's just been really involved, coming to all the community calls, and being active on the forums and on Discord and things like that. So and I know she's a much smaller delegate. So shout out to both of them.
Awesome. And which delegate would you like to see on the podcast next? Could be either one of them, or it could be any other delegate. Which one would you be interesting to see what they have to say on the podcast?
I think, well, I would love to watch a podcast episode with Jack Anorak, I think he goes by. So he's pretty outspoken. I love him because he's not afraid to. I think it's easy to fall into the trap in a governance political sphere of trying not to offend anybody or to let things slide, right? And so one thing that he does a great job of is calling out bullshit when he sees it. I'm not endorsing everything he says, but I think there have been lots of situations where no one really wanted to say anything, and he was the one that was willing to say, "I don't agree with this." So I think he would be a great podcast guest, and he's also, a very active contributor, very interested in the success of Optimism, um, and it would be really interesting to listen to an episode with him.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw Jack in the forums as well, and that's the impression I got as well. Was that he, in a way, he plays devil's advocate in the sense that he does what nobody or most other people do not feel comfortable with, especially as you mentioned in the governance sphere. People tend to be a little kind of like people pleaser, not wanting to kind of like ruin the party of everyone. But at the same time, we do want people like Jack who can call out bullshit, as you mentioned, and kind of like help being the voice of reason. So yeah, and
Exactly.
good thing that
Yeah,
we.
I think it's important for people listening to realize. I mean, I think a lot of people already agree with this, but if somebody is saying something that you don't like, as long as it's in a respectful way, try not to hold that against them, because we need disagreement in governance. We're trying to find the best solution together. And being able to not be people pleasers, right? I think this is just something that it's a problem across any kind of vote-based governance system. You want everybody to be your friend, but let's try and stay friends, even if we have those disagreements, because we really need that in order to have a robust system.
100% agree. And lastly, to end on a very positive note, I'd like to give a shout out to anyone in the Optimism ecosystem, be it an individual, a team, somebody from the foundation, even builder, or simply just a community member that they're doing something in Optimism, they're involved, they're active, and you just like to give a shout out to.
I would love to give a shout out to Justine from the foundation. So Justine, I think I might have already been involved when she started. I don't know if she just became more publicly visible at that point, uh, but since she started, she's really let basically she's tirelessly working. She's always there to help, right? She's always there to answer questions. She's done a lot of really interesting work in improving um, the governance system as a whole, and she's just done an amazing job. So big shout out to Justine from the foundation. We're definitely lucky to have her within Optimism governance, and yeah, she's done an amazing job, and she just keeps getting better and better. So
I
thank
agree.
you, Justine.
Awesome shout out. And Michael, to close this off, where could somebody keep in touch with you, learn more about you? Do you have a Twitter? Do you have maybe a delegate communication thread, or where somebody could keep up to date with you and maybe even with your actions as a delegate?
Sure. The best place is probably my Twitter. It's L Blockchain Guy altogether, or if you just search the Blockchain Guy, I might come up. Um, and then from there, I have links um, to my YouTube channel. I also have a YouTube channel, and I also post links to the community calls and that kind of things. But I guess to add to that, just come to a community call. So every 2 weeks, on Tuesday, we have a community call for Optimism governance, and um, this is a place for literally anybody to jump in, ask questions, understand what's going on. We make real decisions during these calls. And if you're new, it's a great place to just kind of see what's going on within governance, and start getting your voice heard and recognized by being there.
Awesome. Make sure you check it out, everyone. And I'll have your links in the description on YouTube and on Spotify. So anybody who's interested could give you a follow and kind of like keep up to date.
Awesome.
All right.
Cool.
Well, Michael, thanks a lot for being on the podcast and especially in the first episode. Thank you so much for that. And I'll see you around in the ecosystem.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored. And I think also a big shout out to you. So far, like, I mean, this has been a great experience being on the podcast, and I'm excited to see it's really needed in the ecosystem. And so I'm excited to see where it goes with all the delegates. And Yeah, I'm excited that you're doing this.
Thank you so much.
So,
Well, and thanks
all
for
right.
to everyone for tuning in.